Well, it's been suggested that our understanding of, the practice of missions has largely evolved over peacetime. But now we see things changing. We are witnessing the disruption of church and how it carries out its mission. And we're mostly unprepared for that. So, would you think, my dear friends, leaders, that it's time for the church to rethink how we do missions? How can we better prepare the church for the next crisis? Yeah, Randy, and then maybe David, it would be great to hear your inputs, and Mark too on this.
Well, thank you. I don't want to get. I don't want to take too much time or get too go too deep on this, but certainly the way we do church is being impacted, and what we even think church is. Man, I heard one of my African brothers made a statement, and I don't remember who it was, several weeks ago in a meeting, and he was talking about all the churches that are complaining about the fact that they cannot meet physically. And one of my African friends said, in response to this, he said, "Look, if you are suggesting you cannot be the church because you cannot gather physically, you never were the church, and you have much bigger problems." And that's a pointed statement. But we're being, a lot of what we have thought of church is being challenged. And I would dare say that a lot of the ways that we've defined church has been extra biblical. Okay, let's just think for a minute about our ecclesiology, the study of the church, what the church is. A lot of it has been extra biblical. We define the church in a certain way, but it's not necessarily "thus saith the Lord." It's extra biblical. In some cases, we've defined the church in ways that are unbiblical. That's a whole nother story. That's whole nother conversation. And we're being forced to question a lot of that, to ask ourselves, and let's be honest, I struggle with this. And David, I'm sure you do as well, because when we think about what the church is, it is also the people of God gathered. There is that element of koinonia, of relationship. I made this statement to a group of pastors. They were saying, well, it's the forsaking of the assembling. Hebrews talks about the forsaking of the assembling. We can't be the church if we're forsaking the assembling. And I said, well, wait a minute. Let's start with the fact that a lot of churches were gathering every week and forsaking the assembly. Just because you gather doesn't mean that you're assembled. The word there is koinonia. It's the fellowship. So yes, you gathered, but the fellowship was still lacking. So just the fact that we're physically present together doesn't mean that we're honoring what the scripture requires of us. But I struggle with this, and I know that anyone who's working in pastoral ministry is saying the same thing. How do we be the church and not be present? And I certainly think long term, we can't. Whether we're the church in our home gathered or the church in a small group gathered, we still need that element of fellowship. It's essential. It's what I call part of the biblically minimum church. And so along with rethinking the church, we're rethinking how the church does its mission, and how we engage our families, I'm hearing of families that are doing discovery Bible studies with their children at home. I'm hearing of, I'll give you a great example. My own wife has been hosting a discovery Bible study with her cousins and aunts, and it's growing every single week. And some of these are nominal Christians. Some of them are not Christians. Every single week it's gathering. Now their children are gathering, and it's growing, and it stretches across several states, and it's happening every single week. And that wasn't happening. And so the church is adjusting, and there will be adjustments that occur in our mission. But I'll say one last thing, Ferdinand. That's that you ask about this idea of our understanding of church and our understanding of mission has evolved largely in peacetime. Now we talk about
Yeah.
what's happening right now, and we want to use words like unprecedented. And certainly for us, none of us sitting here, I mean, have any of you ever faced anything like this? No. I heard a pastor recently
No.
say, he said, please pray for your pastors. We've never led through a global pandemic before. And that's the case with all of us. But I would suggest that what we know about doing church and what we know about doing mission has largely evolved. Our practice of church and mission has largely evolved in times of peace. Relatively little struggle since World War II. Relatively, and so maybe we need to rethink our approach to church and rethink our approach to mission. And maybe what we need to be doing is listening to, there's been a lot of suggestion. We're listening to our brothers and sisters in China, where there's been extreme persecution, where there is now extreme persecution. What can they teach us about doing church in cells? What can they teach us? What can our friends in the Middle East teach us right now about how the church expands during times of persecution? I think we need to be listening to that.
Thank you, Randy. And thank you, Ferdinand, for your good questions. And about disruption, I can say that the church in the first century experienced disruptions since the beginning. Yeah. So, for example, persecution, some financial crisis, local crisis, global crisis. So when I think in the word disruption is something that we need to be more familiar, especially today. And we can see that we have different kind of disruptions, and that those disruptions will happen very often. Those can be technological, social, financial, etc. And now we are living a disruption caused by COVID. So when I see the church in a crisis, I think that crisis help us see our weaknesses and strengths. And the crisis reveal our character, our beliefs, our real motivations. So I think the crisis is positive because it helps us to change. It helps us to see what is next, what is God preparing for the church. So I see this positive, and this crisis will prepare us for these next 10 years that we are living now. For example, in Comibam, that is the network that where I am serving as chairman in the board, we're thinking that we need to include a risk matrix to have contingency plans for the events. For example, when we did the 2017 Congress, where we had about 2,000 people in Bogota for all Latin American, we didn't include in the risk matrix something like COVID. We did for terrorism, for something like that, but we never imagined that something like a virus could disrupt an event. So we're now, for the future, we need to think, okay, what if it happens again? How our Congress events, mobilization, seminar can be affected? Because as you know, for the next 18 months, for example, we cannot meet thousands of people in one place, in the same place. We need to listen governments. Okay, what are the rules for those kind of meetings, and how we can invent, or how we can do things different, so we can reach people. So this is the kind of question that we need to continue asking for ourselves, and how to help the church and the missions organizations for to what kind of events we need to organize to share the challenges for to continue for doing missions. Thank you.
Well, I want to ask you a question just for clarification about that. So what you're saying is that what has happened has exposed the fact that the church, the mission agencies, mission networks, and even the missionaries were unprepared for this kind of eventuality. And it's crucial that we create a risk matrix, some type of a way of thinking about the possibilities of something like this happening in the future. What does that look like? How do we do that? What are some ways you guys are going to be contemplating that to better prepare the church and agencies and missionaries for these types of eventualities?
Yeah, Randy, I will be very specific for what kind of things we need a risk matrix. For example, event. It's something that we need because we were involving people coming from different organizations, churches to join something. Some of those events are very key for as a catalyst for something in a nation of a region. One more, for example, a project, a missions project. Uh, I want to give you an example. In Colombia, we have about 100 indigenous communities or ethnic communities. At this moment, those communities are closed to any kind of visit because they want to protect themselves about COVID.
Wow.
So we didn't think that, but now how we are going to do missions? So we need to involve this kind of risk matrix and think, okay, how if we cannot go to those communities, what now? What we can do now? How we can empower the local church in the ethnic communities to be more effective, but also how they can reach other neighbor communities with the gospel. So when we think in a missions project, okay, when a risk matrix help us to see all the elements that are involved, but what order we need to think about in order to have a response to be more effective and yeah, no stop to have a contingency in that case.
All right, I just have to extend this to Mary real quick. As an agency leader, and I don't want to get too far off of mobilization, but as an agency leader, are you guys employing some of this same type of thing, risk matrix, to think about your missionaries in the field, to think about projects, to think about how it's disrupting and utilizing this opportunity to put contingency plans in for the future?
Um, that's a great question, Randy. We do not have a specific risk matrix, but what I have done every year is to read scenario planning reports. For example, the U.S. government puts those out where they have 4 plausible scenarios: best case scenario, worst case scenario, and 2 other scenarios. The US military has used it since the 60s. Different multinational companies do it as well, like Shell Oil Company survived a major oil crisis because they were able to project and look at different possible scenarios and plan for it. So actually on my own, I would read these scenario reports, and actually these scenario reports are very well researched, and everything from global warming to they predicted pandemics, that pandemics will shut down national borders, just different scenarios. And I would sit there and think to myself, okay, how are we going to go to the unreached if worst case scenario happens? How will we do, how would our financial structure, organizational structure look like if borders really close down? So no, we don't have a official risk matrix, but I do read different scenario reports, and I find them very, very helpful.
Well, Mary, real quick,
Yeah.
where would we see
Source?
that? Could you put that in the chat or
Yeah, yeah.
something? I think Ferdinand's asking the same question.
Exactly. I was going to ask, where do we find those reports? That would be very, very useful, Mary. Thank you.
Sure, I'll find some for you. Yeah, so I I just find them very helpful, you know, and they also, you know, predict, let's say, you know, possible uprisings or different rogue governments if things get out of control. What will happen to the global balance of power, things like that. I just find it helpful. I don't always understand everything I read, but that's what I do. So,
Mm.
yeah.
One thing I would add, I think, and it is relevant to what David shared and what Mary shared, that when I think about helping the church move through a crisis and beyond a crisis, there are three words that come to my mind. The first is messaging, and having a clear message of a bright future, envisioning what success and victory and fruitfulness might look like. Uh, that is critical, I think, to move into that future, and then the faith risks that would be required to get us there. So messaging, I think, is a key word, but another key word is mapping, and I think mapping has to do with taking a good look at our current reality, but also a good look at our bright future, a vision map, uh, and then also a strategy map that would take us from our current reality into that future. I think that gives us something to work with, thinking about messaging and mapping. And then finally, modeling would be the third key word, that we as leaders need to be modeling, pace setting, all of these things, not just the message, not just the mapping, but living it, living that faith risk life, and giving an example to our constituents of what it looks like to move forward with faith and with success.